going to be presenting two papers here, one that came out more recently, and the one whose title you see here, which came out in May. And what happened here? Can somebody help me from the tech people? This wasn't very well connected, I think. This goes off my 22 minutes, of course. Okay, these are the co-authors. There's 7 of us on this first paper. The usual IMF disclaimer applies. This is not official IMF policy. This is research. There are different models of oil out there, empirical models of oil. Conventional mainstream academic economists would tend to focus on a demand-side approach of modeling the oil market. And their models, and there have been several recent articles about that, they cannot consistently beat a random walk, meaning the best forecast of tomorrow's oil price is today's oil price. This doesn't just apply to those models, but also to surveys of experts and to the futures market. These models tend to pay very little attention to supply. And the problem, therefore, is that they cannot predict an upward trend in the oil price, such as the one that we've been observing in recent years. The supply-side approach, which this crowd will be much more familiar with, are models with hard geological limits. So that means that oil supply constraints play a key role for oil production, and that will then have an effect on prices and on aggregate economic activity. But in that model, there is no role for oil prices. And to our mind, that was also, when we started working on this, this was also wrong. And it is, as we will show, it's not consistent with recent data. So what we do here is to adopt a combined approach where we have geological limits, and they are key to explain the upward trend in oil prices observed in recent years. But demand shocks can increase production. The question is by how much and at what price. And then what we will find is that there's great uncertainty in the data about key parameters, and we can directly evaluate that because this is a statistical model, a statistical forecast of what's going to happen to oil. And we find that this model performs extremely well compared to its competitors out there in the academic universe. So a historical forecast of world oil production, this is a little chart that we put together of what the EIA forecast between 2001 and 2010, in each case going out to 2020. And it's very instructive to compare what these forecasts said for 2020, because basically in every single year, almost, this forecast came down. They have revised their forecast down every single year between 2001 and 2010. There was something qualitative that started to change in 2003. That's where the real break was. That's when the downward trend began. What was that? That was a very steep drop in spare capacity around that time, and that started to trigger higher oil prices. Now, that is sort of the mainstream forecast, the EIA, but then we have the peak oil crowd and Colin Campbell's forecast. So I put 3 of those together in this chart, where the black line is the actual quantity of oil produced, and this is what Campbell defines as regular conventional oil. And we see there the forecast between 2003 and 2010 crept up a little bit. So he became a little more optimistic over time. I don't know whether optimistic is the right word, but in any way, in any event, the production profile that he was forecasting for the future until 2020 improved a little bit. Okay, so that's also therefore not quite right, and perhaps prices had something to do with his revisions. Now, the other way to do forecasts is the DeFay method, which is linearization of the work of Hubbard from 1982. And we have this curve here in the top graph, which has DeFay's predictions of what the annual production in the world relative to cumulative production would be. And the data points that he had available at the time he wrote his book went until 2003, and at that point the line fitted pretty well. But if you fit pretty well. But if you go beyond that, you get pretty sizable deviations from that line right after the point he wrote his book, basically. And as we've seen, what happened at that point is that oil prices went up. So oil prices, in our view, have to be added to the pure geological model. And so here is the first equation of our model, and the most important one, which is the Defay equation that has the Hubbard linearization in it, where Q and Q are lowercase q and uppercase Q are annual and cumulative production. And up to the expression minus beta 1 times cumulative Q, that is exactly what Defay had in his model. But what we do, we add to that the current oil price and a moving average of oil prices 4 to 6 years in the past. The first one can be interpreted as dipping into spare capacity in order to raise production when current prices are higher. And the second one can be interpreted as developing new capacity, which has some lead time of at least 4 years in response to higher oil prices. So what we find, the estimated coefficients are underneath the symbols here. There is a significant role for the geological channel, otherwise the coefficient beta 1 would not have been estimated the way we're estimating it. By the way, estimation here is done with nonlinear Bayesian methods, state-of-the-art methods that can stand academic criticism, just in case that anybody is wondering about that. The coefficients beta 2 and beta 3 are the price coefficients, and you can convert them to elasticities. And what they mean is that the short-run elasticity, the elasticity with respect to the current price, is between 0.05 and 0.15, which is low, but not all that low. But that is to be interpreted as dipping into spare capacity. The second coefficient is 0.005 to 0.02. That's extremely low, which means essentially what that means, building new capacity does not respond very much to the lag of oil prices. Okay, that is. So prices are important, but the big problem is if spare capacity shouldn't be there in the future, this would tell you that the extent to which new capacity can be added in response to higher prices would be relatively limited. Here's an oil demand equation. This is a standard equation in log differences for the quantity of oil responding to the level of economic activity. This is always at the world level, so this is world GDP. Minus the current price level, minus a moving average of 10 years for the price. So the coefficient on GDP is roughly consistent with previous studies, it's just under 1. There are negative price elasticities, so this is people driving less and firms using less oil for their input in their production. The short-run elasticity is 0.02, the long-run elasticity is 0.08. This is totally in line with other empirical studies. We allow for it to become higher at very, very high oil prices, such as the ones observed in 2008, but not exceeding 0.3. And so these are very low elasticities on the demand and the supply side, and if anybody here with an economics background would immediately see that this means trouble if supply were to contract significantly, right? Because then you would have to get very much higher prices. Then on the GDP side, we break down GDP into potential and an output gap, which is standard terminology in economics. I'm leaving a lot out from these equations, except the part that responds to oil prices. And essentially what we're estimating here is that a high oil price growth has a small but significant negative effect, both on the growth rate of potential output and the growth rate of excess demand. But it is small. It is small, and this comes from past data. This is something important to remember, because history so far doesn't really tell us much about what would happen if we were in a situation of a persistent supply crunch. So here's the analysis of these data. What we find is that our model beats the random walk model of forecasting the oil price. These are root mean square errors of predicting the oil price at various horizons into the future. Far smaller forecasting errors on the oil price than a random walk, and as I said, the random walk is hard to beat by conventional models, so this is a good model for the oil price. As far as oil production is concerned, we're doing far, far better than the EIA. Not a surprise, because as we all, or most of us know, traditionally, historically, the EIA forecasts have just modeled supply as matching demand as necessary. So the model does well on forecasting, has much smaller errors on forecasting both prices and quantities. So here is a little decomposition of history. So what we're doing here is we're basically saying, let's estimate the model, let's have these coefficients, and then for oil prices, let's start in 2002 and let's have the model tell us what it would have predicted for oil prices based on no further shocks on either the demand and supply side, and then adding those shocks back. And the model is constructed such that the shocks completely explain actual oil prices. So the blue line that you see in the top left is the actual evolution of oil prices. This is not in dollars, this is normalized, so don't look at the numbers on the vertical axis there. So what this model tells us is that this red line is the line that would have prevailed if no further shocks on the demand and supply side had happened. And it tells us there would have been a steep increase in the oil price that's not that far from what was actually observed without any demand and supply shocks. And this comes exclusively from the Hubbard feature in the specification of the supply curve. So we find that to be powerful. We also find, however, that oil demand and therefore higher prices explains deviations from that trend in the early 2000s. This would be China and India demanding a lot more oil. And that's also true for the output gaps on the bottom right. These are sort of bit more business cycle shocks. For the oil supply, we find that in the very early 2000s, it would actually have contributed to explaining a lower oil price. But then between 2005 and 2008, this shock made an additional contribution to explaining the oil price, because that's when the plateau kicked in, as we saw. This is the interpretation of the history of oil production between 2002 and 2011. And basically there what we find is that there was a deviation from the trend that the Hubbard feature alone would have explained, and that would have been because of demand shocks. There was an increase in demand. The increase in demand caused higher prices, and higher prices led to more production. Here is the forecast starting in 2011. So now we're not explaining history. We're trying to say what's going to happen in the future. This is a point forecast with error bands around it, and the 90% error band are those red dashed lines there. And basically, what we're finding is that starting in 2011, our model would forecast, as the point forecast, a roughly 0.9% per annum increase in output, which is sort of similar, very similar to the latest EIA forecast that we've seen. There is a downside in this. Oh wait, first of all, there are very wide error bands around this. So the data help us to predict the future, but there is great uncertainty in the data because there's a lot of things we don't know, like demand elasticities, supply elasticities, ultimately recoverable reserves, all of that. The downside scenario is that black line with the circles on it, and that's a downside where we're saying, well, let's change one of the coefficients that we've estimated, namely the ones where we can dip into spare capacity when prices are high. Then maybe that's not going to be possible anymore in the future, or let's make that coefficient at least smaller. What we get in that case is that output growth drops to 0.5% per annum. And that will have significant effects, as we will see, when we look at oil prices and especially at GDP. When we look at oil prices, what the model forecasts is roughly a doubling of oil prices over the next decade. Not quite, but almost a doubling of oil prices over the next decade. So while we agree in this model with our forecast of the EIA for what's going to happen to output, our model tells us this can only happen if prices nearly double over the next decade, because prices have to work harder and harder to overcome the geological constraint of the Hubbard feature in our supply curve, which we have found statistically to be significant. More importantly, or just as importantly, if we look at that downside scenario where you can no longer dip into spare capacity to the same extent as you could before, then oil prices would actually fully double during that period. Now, if we go to the forecast for GDP, this is the log level of GDP, so don't let the narrowness of these error bands deceive you. These mean very significant differences between the blue line and the black line. And what I want to highlight, and so the model has a trend growth in world GDP of 4% real built into it. But the black line tells you what would happen if that coefficient on dipping into spare capacity is significantly lower. And that amounts to losing a full percentage point in world growth, real growth, every year. So very significant real effects if that was no longer possible in the future to the same extent. So the conclusion, we started with the objective to evaluate a model that encompasses two diametrically opposite views of the world oil market. One is that resource constraints are decisive, which is what this crowd would be most familiar with. The other is that prices are ultimately decisive, which is why we have prices in the supply curve and, of course, also in the demand curve. We find that the model performs very well and that both features are very important, but the Hubbard feature for the long run would be very important also. So this is a validation of a geological approach, or having that in the model. We get a very sensible decomposition of history, and we get a very good forecasting performance. We match, our forecast for quantities matches the EIA's, but only at the expense of very much higher oil prices. Parameter uncertainty is very large here, so we need to learn a lot more from the data. It's, you know, every additional year of data that we get helps, but that's a little slow, right? Unfortunately. The effects on GDP are not too dramatic. There are effects on GDP, but they're not too dramatic. This requires further research, because if oil prices were really to reach those levels, and not just for a few months, but permanently, then perhaps there's something in the model that doesn't adequately capture a situation like that, because history and the data hasn't ever had a period like that in it, okay? And so what we have therefore started to do is to work on a structural model that helps us to think about this, and this came out much more recently. It's called Oil and the World Economy, Some Possible Futures. That's by myself and Dirk Muir, and again, the disclaimer applies, and I'm going to talk about this only very, very briefly. And perfect, the timing is wonderful. Hamilton is one author in the academic literature that would very much agree with many things that we're saying here, and he's cautious on the supply outlook. But what he always stresses when it comes to the GDP effects of higher oil prices are effects that are more on the demand side. You know, it would damage the automobile industry, it would lead to lower disposable incomes, etc., etc. What we emphasize in our structural work now is the supply effects of low oil quantities, okay? Not the demand effects of high oil prices, but the supply effects of low oil quantities. This will feed back to demand, importantly, but the critical element that we want to look at, and I will discuss this with you right at the end, is the macroeconomic production function and how oil should be entered into it. So there are two aspects to this. One is that energy and oil are key factors of production, whose output contribution, I say here, is, I should have maybe put maybe grossly understated by historic cost shares. Right? The cost shares of oil have been low, 3.5%. So that would tell you if the price on that went up and doubled, okay, it would have somewhat of an effect, but not too dramatic. But perhaps that's understated. So some physicists and engineers have challenged this focus on cost shares, and I agree, I really agree that economists economics is the model of the shopkeeper and not of the engineer and the industrialist. That's really true if you look at the specification of our macroeconomic production function. It's the economics of the shopkeeper, of buying and selling stuff and allocating stuff, and not very sophisticated on how stuff is produced. So I totally agree with what many here in the audience have been stressing for years. So what I want to do is I don't want to go somewhere completely different. I want to adopt a macroeconomic production function that is modified to take some of these insights that come from engineering into account. Okay, so what we have in order to represent that first point is to have a production function where technology, what we have been calling technology, is partly enabled by oil. So if oil were to go away, many of the technologies that we have today would no longer be viable. And then you get a much bigger contribution of oil to macroeconomic output. The second important point is that the substitutability between energy, oil, and other factors may be grossly overstated by ignoring entropy. Economists will always have this reaction that in the short run there may be low elasticity of substitution on the demand side, but in the long run this is going to go up and potentially go up a lot, and so that's going to bail us out. We're going to find substitutes and stuff like that. Now, again, physicists and engineers and people in this audience have challenged that assumption. And if you have entropy in a model, what that would tell you is that ultimately the elasticity of substitution would go to zero once you reach a lower barrier where you have cut out all the waste as much as you could. I mean, there is a lot of waste, and we should cut that out, but there is maybe a limit to which that is possible. And so therefore our approach is to have production functions that require a finite minimum of oil for any unit of output that you want to produce. So then we run some simulations with this, and this is just a little snapshot of that, where there's a lot more simulations in this paper. But basically we have here a baseline scenario that is based on the growth rate of world oil output declining by 1 percentage point, which is roughly in line with what has happened since 2005, okay? And then, and that baseline scenario actually matches, in terms of its predictions, the empirical model that I had in the first part of the talk pretty well. But then I have another scenario that says, let's combine that with this scenario where technology is itself dependent on oil. That's the red line. And then we have another one where the more pessimistic peak oil predictions are embodied, and that will be an absolute decline of the world oil growth rate from plus 1 point something to basically the change by 4 percentage points to -2. Okay, minus 2% growth per annum. So what we find, and the last scenario, which is a bit crazy, combines the two worst case scenarios. What we find is that the output effects of doing this is a sophisticated model of the world economy. Right? This is a model that the IMF uses all the time, not for forecasting, very important, not for forecasting, just to study scenarios. But we put oil into this with these features. And we find that the output effects could range from 0.25% per annum to well over 2% per annum. Okay? But that well over 2% is in the craziest scenario where we have all the worst case scenarios combined. But even in between, you could get a -1%, which is not inconsistent with the empirical model that we saw earlier. More importantly, however, if you look at the US dollar price of oil, where the arrow points here, this is over a period of 20 years. What would happen to the price of oil? In the baseline scenario, it increases by 200% over 20 years, or by 100% over 10 years, which is roughly consistent, as I said, with the scenario that I showed in the empirical model. If you take the oil as technology scenario, you would get 400% after 20 years. And if you take the very large, the very pessimistic supply scenario, you get 800% after 20 years. And if you combine them all, you get some completely crazy number that I'm not even going to mention. And so the model here is basically telling us that, okay, so this would have real effects on the economy, but it would lead to really high oil prices, and then those high oil prices would then lead to the substitution that you need, given these low elasticities of substitution, to make the economy still work. Now, what I want to think about going forward is there something missing? Could we really have an 800% increase in oil prices and everything would adjust as smoothly as this model predicts? And this is basically where I'm talking about the last two slides now, the agenda going forward. The critical object for our analysis is the macroeconomic production function. And Z here is macroeconomic output. And then we have, on the left-hand side there, maybe I can use this. Here we have capital and labor. And here we have oil. And there is an elasticity of substitution, epsilon here, and there are some factor shares, and this is something that every economist would use. And if you guys want to communicate with us, this would be where our language has to start converging, okay? And basically, what are the important components here? Oil is a mostly exogenous production profile of oil or energy. So I'm modeling this as an endowment of oil that for some reason could be decreasing or could be growing less. Then this O to the power of some coefficient is technology that enters, so what economists call total factor productivity, or in this case it would be oil enhancing technological change. And how strong is that coefficient? Does oil have a role as technology or as an enabler of technology? Then this minus beta stuff here, this is basically the entropy. When you put this in, this tells you if you want to produce a certain amount of output, first you need to put some oil in to make sure that your physical infrastructure doesn't degenerate. And anything beyond that can then serve to produce actual economic output. Okay? No idea how to calibrate this. right? And that's something that I need to learn from the data and by playing more with the model. And finally, what is the elasticity of substitution between oil and other factors? We already learned something about that through the empirical model that I had right at the beginning, but there's more to learn because, as I showed you, there was great uncertainty about a lot of these coefficients. So here's my very last slide. What we need to do, what I want to do, is to do a lot of fact-finding to improve our specification of this production function, and also of things like the real cost of production that I didn't even show you, and how much do they grow every year. So we need, of course, what has been discussed here. What is the actual supply output for oil, gas, and coal? Secondly, what is the technical substitutability of other factors for oil, and can we improve our guess of how high the elasticity of substitution could become in the future? Going back to the empirical model, we have some implementation lags there on the supply side. How long does it take if you put if you do new exploration, how long is it going to take for this project on average on a world basis to come on stream? Should we have 4 to 6 years, or is there something better than that? On the demand side, the turnover of the car fleet is 10 to 15 years, I believe, but maybe that's not all we need to worry about. What are the implementation lags of demand to higher oil prices? What is the global marginal cost curve for production? This is very important. If I want to understand in the future what is going to be the elasticity of output with respect to higher oil prices, how much is it going to rise? Are we in a really steep increase? We're clearly in an increasing portion, but how steep is that portion? Very important to know. Are there game-changing exploration technologies, recovery technologies in the pipeline? And if so, what are they? What are their costs? What are the implications for the marginal cost curve, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So there's a lot for us to know, and I'm trying to put a puzzle together, and I'm trying to thereby put this puzzle together and thereby improve the specification of both our empirical and our theoretical model to get a better handle on these issues. And the last bullet here, this is where we need your help. Thank you very much.